All right. There we go. Just getting all that set. Fabulous. Welcome, everyone. Hello to everyone tuning in. We have folks joining here on the Zoom webinar as well as on the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center's Facebook page. So thank you, everyone, so much for joining. Emily is a placement student with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center, and she will be throwing some resources into the chat. If you are tuning in on our Facebook, those resources will be posted as the live stream is posted, not as a live, if that makes sense. So they will be posted after this live stream. So I'm just going to share the presentation here, and then we'll start to introduce ourselves. There we go. Okay, fabulous. So my name is Alicia Fisher. I am the Prevention Education Supervisor with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Centre. We are located in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, on Mississauga, Anishinaabeg land. So thank you so much. And then we've got Amanda here.
Hi everyone, I'm Amanda. I'm from Peterborough Community Legal Centre, and I'm a lawyer and project manager of the Sexual Harassment in the Workplace project.
Amazing. Okay. And so, yeah, it's been thrown into the chat that we are not giving legal advice during the session today. This is more so just about information. And if you're wanting to know, if you're actually wanting some advice, you can actually contact Amanda, and her email is listed there in the chat, and it will be listed on our Facebook shortly. So during the webinar today, just as some self-care, since we are virtual, we cannot actually physically be there to support you. So as a heads up, there will be a content warning where we will be discussing sexual violence and more specifically workplace sexual violence as well. There are two supports that are being thrown into the chat right now. We've got the Kawartha Sexual Assault Centre has a 24/7 web chat support. So if you are looking for someone to talk to and you need some emotional support, we are available there. And then we have the Healing Space, which is a really great interactive grounding and mindfulness space where there's some music, there's some grounding strategies, some videos on that space, so be sure to check it out. Feel free to ask webinar related questions in the Q&A and comment any kind of technical issues that we're having in the chat. This is very much a lunch and learn webinar on what is workplace sexual harassment. There is a lot more details that we could be going into, but today is just a really brief kind of what is it, what does it look like as more general conversations. There are more specific conversations around how to stop workplace sexual harassment and what are your supports there, as well as reporting workplace sexual harassment. So those webinars, which are obviously more longer than this and a lot more detailed and focused, the Stopping Workplace Sexual Harassment webinar is starting on, or is occurring on April 14th at 1 p.m. And the Reporting Workplace Sexual Harassment is happening during Sexual Assault Prevention Month here in Canada, May 12th at 1 p.m. as well. And those, if you want to register for those and learn more information, that those links have been thrown into the chat. Thank you so much, Emily. So what are we going to be talking about today? Amanda and I are briefly going to go over who our centers are. Then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes here. What is the workplace? What defines you as a worker? What is workplace sexual harassment? What is sexual harassment? And then we're going to bring in some statistics. So looking at what's happening at Canada with workplace sexual harassment and has COVID made a difference with that? Then we're going to go over some general reporting options for survivors as well as bystanders. So if you've witnessed workplace sexual harassment, and finally wrap up with supports and resources. So who is the Kawartha Sexual Assault Centre and the Peterborough Community Legal Centre? So the Kawartha Sexual Assault Centre is a non-for-profit feminist organization that supports people who are impacted by sexual and gender-based violence. We are located in Peterborough, Nogojuwan, Ontario at 150 King Street on the 3rd floor. And the areas that we serve are Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, Haliburton, and Northumberland. We offer kind of two different realms. On one side of things, we have individual and group counseling for youth and adult survivors, as well as their supporters. We also offer accompaniment, advocacy, and peer support. So if you are interacting with legal supports, if you are interacting with police, the hospital, maybe your own workplace, we can provide that accompaniment and advocacy alongside you. On the other side of things, we have our public education for youth and adults, schools, community spaces, workplaces, athletic teams, talking about all different conversations surrounding sexual violence, what it is, how can we create trauma-informed spaces, what is effective bystander intervention, and how to support someone who has disclosed to you that they've experienced sexual violence. And then we also offer various 24/7 crisis supports, whether that be through phone, text, or our web chat, as well as a variety of social medias, that being Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and believe it or not, TikTok. Amanda.
Peterborough Community Legal Centre is a legal aid nonprofit clinic. We offer representation to low incomes in the Peterborough area. So there are other clinics in Ontario if you fall outside of Peterborough County that could help you. And our service areas include housing, employment, and income support. The Sexual Harassment in the Workplace project, which is the project that funds this seminar today, is a project funded by the Department of Justice Canada, and the project aims to increase knowledge on the rights and responsibilities of employees and employers around workplace sexual harassment. And we also provide free legal advice to those impacted by sexual harassment at work. So as Alicia said, today's seminar is really just to give you some legal information about what is workplace sexual harassment. And if you think you have experienced workplace sexual harassment, you can contact me at the clinic and we can have a one-on-one chat. So what is the workplace? The workplace nowadays is obviously more than the four walls of the workplace, of the building that you may work in the office, the department, the warehouse. It can also include socializing after work, sports or activities with coworkers. So, you know, people who get together to play on the hockey team, or they get a baseball team together. It can also include conduct on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, any social media platform that you access. If there is a connection to your workplace in the conduct that you're doing, then it could be considered the workplace. And then also obviously offsite meetings, events, and locations. So a lot of times that could include Christmas parties, after work parties. If you are in construction and you have to go to multiple sites, or anywhere where you have to go outside of your work office or workplace to do your work, that could be considered the workplace. The most important thing to remember is that there must be a connection to the workplace. So when we talk about social media, if it can be connected back to your workplace, or if it creates a hostile or poisoned work environment because of your conduct outside of work, then it can be considered your workplace. So who is a worker? In Ontario, a worker can include a variety of people. So it's not just about being paid, it's not being salary. It can include co-op students, volunteers, consultants, so people who come in part-time, temporary workers. We always get asked, you know, I only work 10 hours a week, or I'm here as a temporary worker. Does that count? Yes, that still counts. Visitors to your workplace, whether they're friends, family, you know, sometimes organizations join together to do training or have events together. Those other people that come into your workplace, they can be considered not necessarily a worker, but connected to the workplace. And then anybody who enters the workplace as a tradesperson, construction, IT, any type of external services that comes into the workplace to provide services for you, could be somebody who could cause sexual harassment in your workplace.
Right. So we're talking about, you know, what is the workplace? Now, what is sexual harassment? So sexual harassment, it kind of falls under an umbrella of sexual violence. And as you see with sexual violence, there's a lot of different acts that can happen underneath this umbrella, like the sexual assault itself, flashing, sharing inappropriate photos, videos, exploitation, trafficking, voyeurism, ongoing abuse. This can be online, in person, verbal, emotional, and of course, sexual harassment falls under that. And so what is the definition then of sexual harassment? Under the Ontario Human Rights Code, sexual harassment is engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct that is known or ought to be known as unwelcome. And so that can include a whole variety of different kinds of acts. Sometimes we get the question of what's the difference between sexual assault and sexual harassment. And sexual assault more so involves the physical assault even in and of itself. And that does include rape. And so sexual harassment can be making conditions dependent on sexual favors, either explicitly or implicitly. So having this expectation that you have to be doing this in order to receive this, especially if it's sexual in nature. They can also be the physical acts of sexual assault. So not so much the assault itself, but kind of the acts going and leading up to it, requests for sexual favors, verbal harassment of a sexual nature. That includes sexual jokes that could be referring to sexual acts or sexual orientation, unwanted touching or physical contact, unwelcome sexual advances, discussing sexual relations, stories, fantasies in inappropriate places. And I know Amanda's going to be jumping into the workplace in just a moment. Feeling pressured to engage with someone sexually, exposing oneself or performing acts on oneself to other people non-consensually, and unwanted sexually explicit photos, emails, text messages that are being shared without the consent that is sexual in nature.
So what is workplace sexual harassment? Alicia just gave you a lot of examples that also fall in under what is workplace sexual harassment. The Occupational Health and Safety Act, in addition to the Human Rights Code, protects workers from workplace sexual harassment. And specifically, the Occupational Health and Safety Act states that sexual harassment is, again, engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace. So key distinction there is the workplace. When we talk about sexual harassment generally under the Human Rights Code, it can also apply in terms of your housing, trade organizations, and services. So if you're receiving services from, say, your college or university. And then the conduct or comment is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. And then it also includes making a sexual advance or solicitation where the person making the advance is in a position to grant or deny a benefit to the worker. So what does that mean? It generally means that there has to be more than just the act, or it has to be more than one situation, unless it's really serious. When we talk about known or not reasonably to be known, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We can go to the next slide. So it can also include threat of reprisal. So when we talk about threat of reprisal and workplace sexual harassment, we're talking about threatening to penalize or otherwise punish an employee or a worker who refuses to comply with sexual advances. So it's not just like physical, it can also include being hostile towards someone because they rejected the sexual advance. It can include excessive scrutiny at work. It can include excluding someone socially, so purposefully excluding them in the workplace because they rejected the sexual advance, or other negative behavior because of the rejection or proposition. So even asking somebody for a date, and then if somebody says no and you treat them differently at work, it could be considered sexual harassment and threat of reprisal. When we talk about unwelcome behavior, like the definition states, there are kind of three areas that we talk about. The first is whether the perpetrator knew the behavior was unwelcome, the comments or conduct. The second is whether a reasonable person, so somebody else in the workplace, what would they have thought if they had witnessed or experienced that? And then obviously also how the targeted person felt. So did they think they were being sexually harassed? Because that would be taken into consideration. Sometimes we get questions about, well, they never said no, they didn't tell me that they didn't like the comments, we were joking around, they were laughing. So when we talk about workplace sexual harassment, the absence of a no or any type of physical or visual cues that the person is uncomfortable does not mean it is still acceptable. So even if somebody doesn't say no, that doesn't mean it's okay to continue the behavior. And the more important thing to remember also in the workplace is that witnesses can also be impacted by sexual harassment. So that targeted behavior doesn't have to impact just the person experiencing it. It can also impact your coworkers and colleagues. And if they feel that the workplace has become hostile, it can be considered a poison work environment, and the employer can still be liable for that behavior. So as Alicia said, there are a bunch of different types of situations where there is sexual harassment, and they also overlap with workplace sexual harassment because we're really talking about the conduct. And when we break it down, we tend to break it down into 3 areas. The first we talk about is visual sexual harassment. So that includes sending sexual images or videos to another person, sharing someone's sexual pictures or images without consent. So when we're talking about workplace, that could be in the physical workplace. It could also be through social media, but it's with colleagues and it's about a colleague. So that's that connection to the workplace that we were talking about earlier. It can also include staring or leering or gestures and displaying sexualized images or content. So we hear about that in terms of pictures in lockers, pictures in the staff room on bulletin boards, lewd jokes and cartoons in the workplace in a public area. And then the second area that we talk about in terms of sexual harassment is verbal sexual harassment. So that can include making inappropriate jokes, remarks, teasing, or asking sexually related questions, asking someone to go out with you and not taking no for an answer, sexual advances, questions about sexual or gender identity or anything related to sex generally, commenting about a person's clothing, body, or personal behavior. So we hear that a lot in terms of, gossip, like, oh, that person gets around a lot, or that person already slept with half the workplace. Those are the kinds of comments we're talking about that can be considered sexual harassment. And then also sending someone sexual emails, notes, or letters. And again, that can include text messages, texts through Zoom, comments, anything virtual, really. And then the last area that we talk about is physical sexual harassment. Physical sexual harassment includes unwelcome touching of another person's hair, clothes, or body, using intimidating gestures, deliberately brushing or rubbing against your body. So we do see that where people pretend that it was an accident, blocking another employee's movements. That's really serious when we see that. Forcing someone to be hugged or kissed, any type of touching. So just don't touch your colleagues. That's like basic rule. Don't touch each other, and then you should be safe. And then obviously sexual assault, abuse, or rape, which can occur in the workplace. And then we also talk about gender-based sexual harassment. So it's under that umbrella that Alicia was talking about. So the point of separating it is because it can be, it's a little more different than the general sexual harassment we see in the workplace. It's generally less overt. So it's not something that is very visible in the workplace. It tends to be jokes. It's a form of sexual harassment, and it's generally not motivated by sexual interest or intent. So that's where it kind of separates from those things we just discussed. And it's defined as any behavior that polices or reinforces traditional heterosexual gender norms. So that can include like making comments about people's gender identity, gender expression, sexual identity, and it increases with intersectionality. So we see an overlap with people who identify in the LGBTQ+ community, who are racialized, or who have disabilities. And as I mentioned, it's generally not as overt as other forms of sexual harassment, and it's usually hostile. So those comments or jokes, and they continue and continue. And the purpose of the conduct is to really make the target, the person experiencing it, feel unwelcomed or ridiculed in the workplace. So again, it's not that physical stuff that you see, it's those little comments or jokes that, if left unchecked, can continue and create a poisoned work environment.
Certainly. And I think just going along with this and workplace sexual harassment, this isn't simply just a bad day at work. Someone's just doing this because they want to have fun and get you to loosen up and relax. What workplace sexual harassment comes down to, and really sexual violence and gender-based violence as well, is that it's about power and control. So how can I exert power and control over somebody, right? I have the ability to want to make someone more relaxed. And so I'm going to do this by making these inappropriate jokes or touching them inappropriately or just touching them generally. And so this is really, again, about power and control and not just a bad day at work. So sorry, Amanda, anything to add? I just wanted to add that little point there.
Yeah, and when we also see an increase in gender-based sexual harassment, it's generally linked to workplaces that are less diverse. And so there's more of an increase in those workspaces where there isn't as much women, male-dominated fields, where there isn't as much diversity in the employees that are working there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great segue into stats. So what is going on with workplace sexual harassment in Canada? And what we currently have in terms of these stats, and thank you so much, Emily, for throwing those into the chat. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 8 men have been harassed at work at some point during the year. And these stats are actually pre-COVID stats and came out in 2018. Verbal abuse was experienced most often, with 13% of women and 10% of men reporting it within the last year. The next most prevalent of that was humiliating behavior, 6% of women and 5% of men. Women were found to suffer physical violence at twice the rate of men and 5 times as likely to report sexual harassment or unwanted sexual attention. Disabled women, Indigenous women, girls and young women, lesbian, bisexual women, and gay and bisexual men are more at risk at experiencing violence. And this was from Stats Canada that we had in there. And so where is this these acts happening? And so typically during our more in-depth, we actually have a little poll that comes up, and we start to think about, where do you think sexual harassment is reported the most? Federal public service, healthcare, education, sales and services, trades and related. And I think we typically see trades and related and healthcare actually coming out on top. I think that's what we typically see. But what's really fascinating is that federal public service comes in the highest, followed very closely by healthcare with 29 and 28% respectively. And not too far behind, we have education, sales and service, and trades and related. And I think it's really interesting to think about how these are different based on the fact that they're reported, right? In a federal public service, and maybe Amanda can attest to this a little bit more than I can, but you do feel that line of protection to be able to report. And it's almost as if reporting workplace sexual harassment is something that is more acceptable within a federal public service, as opposed to trades and related, where, oh, it's just part of the job, you're supposed to do that, carry on. Amanda, do you have something to add there? I'm just gonna go grab my water, sorry.
Yeah, the other thing is the organizations like the Federal Public Service, the Ontario Public Service, other provincial governments, they have programs and policies in place. They have robust systems to help address workplace harassment. They're a large organization, so they have a lot of resources, they have a lot more money. And when we start to talk about the sales and service industries, they're, that's privately owned businesses. It might be a small restaurant, it might be a farming community, a farming organization, where they don't have that robust system to help support the implementation of policies and procedures to prevent and stop workplace sexual harassment. And then trades and related, the reason why we think it's so low is because of the traditional male-dominated aspect of that area. It's changing a lot. We're seeing a lot of movement. We're seeing people go into fields that they traditionally wouldn't go into, which is great, but that doesn't mean that people are feeling secure enough to make those reports because of the historical nature of the organization or the situation, and then also because those systems aren't in place to help support them through that process. And I should note that it is required of all employers in Ontario to have a workplace harassment policy and program. It is required under the Occupational Health and Safety Act that you have a policy in place, and failure to do so can result in really hefty fines from the Ministry of Labour and being sued. So, and if you want to know more about your rights as an employer, just let us know and we'll hook you up with a session.
All right. And so, who was more likely to sexually harass someone in the workplace? colleague, supervisor, manager, client, customer. And I think, Amanda, we see colleague and supervisor, manager typically come out on top. But what we see, and again, these are in terms of what's been reported, is that client, customer comes in with 56%, colleague 44, and supervisor and manager. And I think that when we think about workplace sexual harassment and who is perpetrating these forms of harassment, that it's much easier, a lot less barriers rather, to call in or call out a customer or a client who's being inappropriate, because typically you're not going to lose your job based on a client harassing you. But if you have a supervisor or a manager or a colleague, there's a lot more barriers to reporting out of a fear of losing your job, fear of losing shifts, etc. Amanda, did you have anything to add with that? Yeah.
No, that's basically it. Like, I think we would see a lot higher statistics if people felt more comfortable being able to report about their supervisors or managers. And that goes back to what Alicia was talking about the power imbalance. It's not just about a bad day at work. It also is reflected in the statistics, that when power imbalances exist and why statistics are skewed one way versus the other.
Certainly.
So even today, we've been in COVID for a year. Most people have been working virtually for the last year, and we've heard things. Well, how can sexual harassment still be happening in the workplace if you're not in the workplace? And I mentioned earlier that the workplace is beyond, the office space. Right now, Alicia and I are at work, but we're both in our homes. And so we're still working. So if somebody were to send a really inappropriate text in the chat there, that talked about Alicia and I in a derogatory sexual manner, then we are currently being subjected to sexual harassment. And interestingly, we have seen that even with the move to the virtual workplace, the instances of sexual harassment are not decreasing. Some stats out there there's not as many stats because nobody's tracking this. At the start, everybody was really worried. They didn't know what to do. Everybody had to get back online. It was a whole big switch to the online office for probably everybody in the world. But, there have been instances reported in the press of email, video calls, text messages, and private messaging that have been found to be sexual harassment. There's a case where a gentleman was caught masturbating on a Zoom call, and, then he tried to say he didn't think he was on the camera and that it wasn't really what people thought it was. And so it's happening because people, for some reason, feel more protected behind their computers. And a report out of the UK said that they found 45% of women said that they are still experiencing sexual harassment remotely from their homes, from virtual workplaces. Of those women surveyed, 23% said that the sexual harassment has actually increased for them since COVID happened. So that's a pretty high statistic for only one area of the world. And we're not talking, all over. We're just talking in the UK. And then 7 in 10 women said that they felt that their employer was not supporting them. So one of the reasons why they said that was because they found that employers were using COVID to delay the response to the complaint. So either they were saying, well, we can't deal with it because we're remote and it prohibits us from being able to move the issue forward, or they're using COVID as a way to delay responding even to the complaint. And so, there are legal implications for that if the employer fails to respond. But so we're seeing COVID not only change the workplace, but also we're still seeing sexual harassment in the workplace. And we're also seeing employers not be as responsive to the complaints because of COVID. So COVID hasn't changed the workplace as much as we think, because everything that was happening before is still happening now.
It's almost as if there's like a digital footprint in a way with some things, like, being able to take those screenshots, being able to, have these video conferences be like live streamed so that people are seeing them and can have them be redistributed, right? So, I wonder if that kind of comes into it too, but.
Yeah, I mean, some of the statistics said that they didn't see an increase because people are more they're live, or there is that ability to you know, save the chat, take a snapshot of any chats or text messages. Other people are in those meetings, whereas before maybe not everybody would be in the meeting room. So I can understand that point of view, but at the same point, you know, not everybody's sitting there waiting to be sexually harassed and taking a snapshot of that chat, which may disappear. Like once it closes, it's not always there. It depends on the program you're using. So I can understand that the statistics aren't there to say both ways, but just because we're virtual doesn't mean it goes away. And I think there are people who did it before find new ways and new avenues to do that in a virtual world. So what are some options for reporting for survivors and bystanders? So the first we're going to talk about is survivors. So what can survivors do, or people who are experiencing sexual harassment do when they experience it at work? So the first would be you can file an internal complaint with your employer. So as I mentioned earlier, your employer should have a workplace policy and procedure program to address workplace sexual harassment. So they have to respond to the complaint. There has to be an investigation, and that investigation must be appropriate to the circumstance. So that it depends on the workplace. It depends on the issue coming forward. And then they also have to let you know the outcome of their investigation or the review of your complaint. And if your employer fails to do that, there are mechanisms in place for you to seek some restitution. So at the clinic, we can help you figure out what path you want to take, what options are available to you. And one of the things that we do help with is, you know, telling the employer of their requirements and getting the Ministry of Labor to come in and remind them. And when that happens, they get fined. We've seen fines up to $65,000, which can really hit an organization hard. If you're a unionized employee, so in Ontario, you may belong to a union. Federally, you may belong to a union, and you should speak to your union. There are processes internally through the union. They can support you through that process. And one thing we talk about when we have our more detailed seminar is the difference between provincial and federally regulated employees. And, you know, there are differences. The main is just the legislation that we use to assist you in asserting your rights. But if you're unionized, it doesn't make a difference in that context, because your union and your collective agreement will help guide the process. And then, as I mentioned, there's over 20 legal aid clinics doing this work on workplace sexual harassment. If you contact me, I can make sure you get set up with the proper clinic if you're not in Peterborough. And what we will help you with is identifying your legal rights. So you may be able to file a human rights complaint. You may be able to sue your employer depending on the situation, or bring a small claims action against them. You can file a WSIB claim. Those are extremely difficult to be successful in, because there's a whole bunch of tests that the WSIB requires, but that's something we can talk to you about. And then the Ministry of Labor as well. So we can assist you in that process, or you can reach out to the Ministry of Labor yourself. There are a couple other areas that the Ministry of Labor helps with. And then, you know, Alicia was talking about sexual assault at the beginning, and that does fall within sexual harassment. It does happen in workplaces more often than we'd like to admit. And in those cases, there are criminal processes that can take over and should be happening if you're comfortable with that. And one thing that we like to do is walk you through all the different options, because they are different, and you may not feel comfortable going through a criminal process. You may not want to bring a complaint yet. And there are all kinds of timelines that fall into these different areas that you have to be mindful of. You know, there are limitation periods. So a human rights complaint, you only have a year to file that from the last date. So we need to let you know those details. We need to let you know all the kind of legal parts that you may not know, and that your employer wouldn't necessarily outline either in their sexual harassment policy.
Yeah, it almost sounds like that there's multiple options, and not one is the right way, but you know, knowing of these options can really be empowering for an individual who has just kind of had that power taken away. And there's no right way to be a survivor. You don't have to report, you don't have to go through all these all the different steps, but there are options that you can do.
Exactly. And we're here to help you with the legal aspect, and Alicia and KSAC are there to help you with the emotional and mental health aspect. And we work together to make sure that the referrals are being made to the appropriate organizations. You know, if you end up leaving your work, or if you end up losing your job because of the sexual harassment, that's something else we can help with, and, you know, guide you to the proper resources. And there's more than just Alicia and I doing this work. There's other organizations that we're going to talk about in a bit that you know, you may want to tap into to get some help. And then reporting for bystanders. So there's actually more than what's listed here. So one of the things is talking to the complainant and offering your support. And one great training that Alicia offers is bystander intervention. So that is completely separate. And that's why we don't have that on this list, is intervening when you see it happening, because we want to make sure that you know how to do that safely and properly. And Alicia would, like, there's great training that she offers that we offer jointly when we talk about workplace sexual harassment and how to intervene. So when we talk about giving support to the complainant, we mean after the fact. You know, the first thing you should do is make a note of it somewhere and make sure you have a record of it outside of the workplace, what you observed, so that you can remind yourself if it becomes an issue later. And then reaching out to that person who's experienced it, letting them know that you can offer support, talking to them about what their options are. Maybe they don't know that the legal clinics exist. Maybe they don't know that there's a policy. So you may have those ideas and you can share that with them. And then you do have an obligation as an employee to report the conduct. So, you know, often people will say, well, it didn't impact me, so it doesn't matter, and I don't have to report it. It's up to them to report it. And that's simply not true. There's a positive obligation for employees to know when there's an unsafe work condition in their workplace, and sexual harassment can be considered an unsafe working condition. So if you observe that, not only do you have an obligation to report it, but you could also be partially liable for failing to report it because you've allowed it to happen in the workplace. You know, we talk about that a lot. We hear that a lot. Well, they saw it happen. They didn't do anything to intervene. They didn't tell anybody. They just let them make those comments. And again, that's why bystander intervention training is important, but also knowing that you can verbalize to your employer, whether it's your manager, supervisor, human resources, your union steward, that you've witnessed something. And if you do that and you get fired, then you can come to the legal clinic and we can help you figure out what to do next, because similar to a complainant who brings a complaint, they are not supposed to be fired. So if you bring a complaint on behalf of your coworker, you should not face any reprisal for that either. And then you could also contact the Ministry of Labor if you think your employer is not being responsive. You know, there's all kinds of options available to you as a bystander. Again, reporting and recording is really important. So, you know, keeping a record outside of the workplace. If you were in a group chat and some conduct happened, you know, screenshotting that group chat and keeping it somewhere safe, making a note in a notebook, in your agenda, in a diary, you know, on your computer, whatever way you need to make that note to keep that record, because you can provide that either to your employer and to your manager, or if if it goes to the Human Rights Tribunal, maybe that will become evidence. And it's just important because somebody may not make a complaint. Like Alicia said, you may not bring a complaint in the first week or days that it happens. It may be months down the road. And even in a month's time, your memory changes and you might not remember those little things that you remembered in the moment that you wrote down. So we really do want people to think about keeping some type of record. And then we also talk about following up on conversations you may have with your manager or supervisor about the complaint. So if you go to your supervisor or manager and you say, you know, I just saw this happened. I don't think it was safe. It worries me. You know, what does it mean for the workplace? And they're like, yeah, we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. You may want to send an email later on and just say, just letting you know that we had this conversation or we had a discussion about this issue. You know, I've made note of it. So FYI, because that might trigger them to A, think about the fact that they promised they would do something and they have a legal requirement to do something, and B, then you have a record showing that you actually took some type of action, or at least tried to report it to your employer, and you've fulfilled your obligation to make that report. Alicia, do you want to add anything?
No, yeah, for the reporting for bystanders, that bystander intervention is absolutely crucial to know the different ways that you can or can't get involved. And in this bystander intervention workshop, we go over extensively the different types of barriers and how to overcome those barriers. So it doesn't look like a lot on here, but the reporting side is certainly, comes down to like your own mental health, but also, how do you support the individual that you witness that, and then how do you support yourself, right, to navigate that kind of vicarious trauma of seeing that kind of act happen in the workplace.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's different types of supports and resources, and as been said, these will also be thrown into the Facebook video afterwards. But looking more at the sexual violence, mental health, trauma side of things, the Kawartha Sexual Assault Centre is located in Peterborough, Nagojawon, and you may be wanting to connect with a local sexual assault centre in your area. So you can connect with the Ontario Coalition of Ripe Crisis Centres, OCRCC, sexualassaultsupport.ca. That link's been thrown into the chat about where local sexual assault centers are within your region and your area. So that's a really great resource to connect to all those centers and the supports that they offer.
And then we also have a link here that we're going to throw up in the chat for Government of Ontario resources. So that includes a variety of different mental health supports, connections for housing support, connection for mental health resources, employment resources as well, and their 24-hour helpline for mental health crisis, and then also specialized options for Indigenous and LGBTQ plus folks as well, because the options that you have available to you, they might not be, they're not cookie cutter, so you might not like one resource, you might want to try other things. And then we also provide the Ontario Legal Aid Clinics search. So you can search for your clinic through that website, and you can get hooked up with your local legal aid clinic. There are 20 of the multiple clinics in Ontario that provide support, as well as the Human Rights Legal Support Centre. But if you contact me at the Peterborough Community Legal Centre, I can also provide you a direct referral to the appropriate resource so that you have that.
Awesome. So again, if you're wanting more information about how we can stop workplace sexual harassment, that webinar is happening in April on the 14th at 1 p.m. and that webinar link has been thrown into the chat. And if you're wanting a lot more detail about the reporting side of workplace sexual harassment, that will be happening May 12th at 1 p.m. And thank you for throwing those into the chat to get registered.
And this is the Community Legal Center's information. So if you want to give us a call, we are mostly working remotely. We do have private interview options available, but the first thing to do is give us a call to book an appointment, and you and I will chat and I can walk you through your legal options. Often we see that people who are experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace are also experiencing other issues that they need legal advice on, and we can also ensure that if there's anything else you need help with legally that fall within our area of expertise, then we can provide that as well.
And the Kawartha Sexual Assault Centre has 3 lines of that 24/7 crisis support, and we've had a lot of different folks accessing support for a variety of different reasons. Certainly the workplace is there. There's also school, at home right now, as we're all isolated and potentially with someone that could be harming us. So again, those support lines are available 24/7. Whether that be on the phone, but if you're living with someone who may be harming you, maybe the text and the online supports are a better option for you. So those are there, as well as our social medias.